So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Carl Smallwood. That's Carl with a K and Smallwood with a small and then a wood. If you don't believe me, you can check out my links below to my social media to see for yourself. And while you're down there, why not follow the links for social media of the author of today's piece, Larry Holdsworth. Because today we're talking about the Enlightenment, stumbling in the darkness. Just as well, for the record for everyone at home, this video contains a lot of French pronunciations. And while I've done my best to look up those pronunciation guides online, I may make some mistakes here and there, so forgive me for that. Also, I'm literally recording this on December 22nd, like 3 days before Christmas, because I messed up the recording of the original one, so forgive my appearance. I wasn't expecting to be on camera again until the new year when I'd had a haircut, got myself a fresh lid, so apologies for my slovenly appearance, which is where everyone in the comments is like, well, you look exactly the same, Carl. You always look like a mess. And to those people, thank you very much. I try my best. Cheers. So there is some disagreement among scholars and historians over the exact point that marks the beginning and the end of the period in history known as the Age of Enlightenment. Some believe it began in 1637 when French philosopher and scientist René Descartes published his discourse on the method, which included his now iconic statement, "Cogito ergo sum," I think therefore I am. Others cite the beginning of the age as the publication of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica half a century later. French historians, on the other hand, often cite the death of Louis XIV in 1715 as the beginning of the Enlightenment, with the storming of the Bastille in 1789 marking its rough end. They encounter arguments from others within their own field who argue that the end of the era is close to the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Whatever the exact dates the Age of Enlightenment began and ended are, it is generally defined as a period of, and I quote here, rigorous scientific, political and philosophical discourse that characterised European society, at least according to the British Library. Others call the same era the Age of Reason, but it's the same thing either way. It was a period which saw the influence of the Pope, the Roman Catholic Church, the Christian and biblical beliefs challenged by new and often radical ideas. These radical ideas were the equality of mankind, religious tolerance, scientific knowledge, the separation of church and state, individual liberty, and the legitimacy of constitutional government. Basically the founding stones of, modern life as we know it today. So the divine right of kings was refuted and replaced by the consent of the governed as the legitimate basis for rule. The Enlightenment then saw the spread of new and often, as mentioned, radical ideas, not through the pulpits and the Montessori's of Europe, but rather through the coffee houses, the Masonic lodges, the private academies. Censorship, imprisonment, exile, trials for heresy and treason, and other weapons were deployed by the authorities in the states in an attempt to staunch the flow of new ideas that were liberating for some, though too often were perceived as threatening to the powers of the day, as is often the case with new ideas that espouse equality and liberty for all. It is no coincidence then that the Enlightenment was followed by the Age of Revolution, as autocratic governments were ousted in North and South America as well as over here in Europe. Chief among the new ideas inherent during the Enlightenment was the need to question authority. Authority responded by suppressing these ideas through the banning of books, of plays, of operas, and even organisations such as the Freemasons, which went about as well as you'd expect, given we're still talking about it hundreds of years later in a YouTube video. So in 1784, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant addressed the issue of the age in an essay he titled Answering the Question, What is Enlightenment? Within he gave his version of the answer in the Latin phrase sapere aude, which translates to English as roughly dare to know. The Enlightenment represents humanity's search for answers, attempting quite literally to dare to know the unknowable. During the early days of the Enlightenment, the discipline known as science was considered under the heading of natural philosophy. It included physics, studied by Isaac Newton, among others, which was sometimes degenerated by other philosophers of the age. For example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a leading French philosopher, considered pure sciences such as physics to be alienating to humanity, since it represented a separation of man from nature. To Rousseau, mankind's true happiness could only be attained when he existed in his most natural state. Rousseau expanded on this and considered the study of natural philosophy as a removal of that natural state, the simple acceptance of existence. Instead, the perceived need to explain that existence through zoology, mineralogy, anatomy and other philosophies was, to his mind, detrimental to his natural role in creation. During the latter years of the Enlightenment, as European explorers discovered the natives in Polynesia and other faraway lands living in a state of nature, apparently in a nearly idyllic state, Rousseau cited them as evidence of the proof of his own views. Others disputed Rousseau's views regarding science and nature. It was during the Enlightenment that, in fact, great strides were made using scientific thought to help explain and later exploit nature itself. For example, the Montgolfier brothers of France, having recognised that warm air rises in relation to the cooler air, used the principle to create the first lighter-than-air balloon, allowing man to ascend to the sky, conquer the skies, a hitherto unknown region of the world we could not explore with impunity, was now open to us thanks to our minds. Frenchman Antoine de Lavoisier, on the other hand, revolutionised the study of chemistry and the experimental method of research. A British subject in colonial America, Benjamin Franklin, conducted research into what he called electrical fluid and established that lightning was a naturally occurring electrical discharge. It was also Franklin who first charted what was then the little-known eastbound mid-Atlantic Ocean current, which caused trips from the New World to Europe to require far greater times than westbound journeys of the same distance. He was the first to describe the current as the Gulf Stream, and his findings were largely ignored by British seamen, at least for several decades. When it was realised that by following Franklin's charts and avoiding the influence of the Gulf Stream, several weeks could be trimmed from voyagers carrying cargoes from America over to Europe, thus saving money, the real reason the world goes round. His charts became a major influence on sea travel. Thus, his scientific discovery directly affected travel, commerce, wealth and communications, literally the world over. The discoveries by Franklin, Lavoisier, the Montgolfiers, the scores of others were ignored by the universities of higher learning, which were dominated by the clergy, Anglican, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist and others. Instead, new findings became the topic of discussion in various societies, academies, private clubs, libraries and the lodges of Freemasonry. Within, the emerging scientists exchanged information, opinions, discoveries and theories. Often, they printed their findings in books and pamphlets and correspondence and then later essays. These findings appeared as natural philosophy and drew the attention of other natural philosophers, who delved into them and expounded upon them, and of course argued about them incessantly with others, because that's what people want to do when new information is learned. The role of England during the Enlightenment is often overlooked in many historical texts covering the era, largely because many of the ideas associated with the Enlightenment were already prevalent within British society, at least a little bit. Yet, several revolutionary works emanated from British minds, none more so than an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, written by a Scottish philosopher and scholar named Adam Smith, usually referred to simply as The Wealth of Nations. Smith's work introduced modern economics to the world. It was not without controversy, because, it involved money, and money is the thing people don't want you messing with. So Smith argued against government interference on free trade, including the existence of protective tariffs, and supported what is now known as free market theory. He created the idea of the division of labour, supported competition in industry, and refuted the idea of wealth, or its lack thereof, of being God-given. Yeah. Being rich doesn't make you better than other people. Suck it, Jeff Bezos. He agreed with his friend, Scottish philosopher David Hume, that knowledge is gained solely through experience. Both men denied the existence of miracles as described in the Bible, and both denied that the apparent order in nature was itself an argument for the existence of God. And such was the influence of Scotland's leading philosophers and minds that Voltaire, yes, that Voltaire, today widely considered a leading figure of the Enlightenment, wrote, and I quote, "We look to Scotland for all of our ideas of civilization." Clearly, he'd never been to Edinburgh on a Friday night, specifically a kebab shop at 1 o'clock in the morning. He would not be saying that. I love Scotland. I'm half Scottish, by the way. This is called self-depreciating humour. I've got some feedback from the guys behind the scenes that says, your wages might get lowered if you keep making fun of Americans. They don't know what banter is. Stop it. So I apologise. Yet Voltaire did not ignore English society and government in his works. In addition to his admiration of Isaac Newton, Voltaire admired the work of Joseph Addison, Alexander Pope, and the satirist Jonathan Swift. And I love Jonathan Swift. Everybody should read A Modest Proposal, because I remember learning when I was doing journalism, like a module on it at least in university, and they told us about Jonathan Swift and basically how he invented sarcasm and how people took it seriously, because just that level of just like sarcasm had not been displayed before or since, I think. It was just, we should just feed the hungry, we should feed the homeless to the hungry and then there's no problems. And I was like, what are you talking about? You're a monster. It's like, I'm clearly taking the piss. Like just the original Mad Lad. So his experience there led him to support a constitutional monarchy as the best possible form of national government rather than an absolute monarchy found in France. Much of Voltaire's savaging of the French nobility, the church and the feudalism there present in France evolved from his British holiday. Is it holiday the right word? His time in Britain, then. For the rest of his life, Voltaire argued for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the complete separation of church and state, all concepts he observed, at least in varying degrees, as being practiced widely in Britain. The contributions of Britain and French freethinkers were also considered by leaders in the English-speaking colonies of North America, from Massachusetts to Virginia. The ideas of John Locke, Isaac Newton, David Hume, Voltaire, and other European luminaries were often discussed in the coffee houses, Masonic lodges, taverns, and other gathering places. A young Alexander Hamilton studied the ideas of Adam Smith and other emerging economic scholars. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, James Otis, and other great legal minds of the American colonies debated their opinions and philosophies emanating from Europe. In North America, the seeds of revolution and self-governance found fertile soil and began to grow. And that's the great irony there, that the ideas that eventually led to the American Revolution were inspired in part by ideas coming from Britain itself. Massive own goal there, Britain. So if you're wondering why I'm holding a coffee in this particular one, even though it should be my holiday, it's because there's an entire section on drinking coffee. By the middle of the 18th century, coffee was a wildly popular beverage throughout Europe, the British Isles, and North America. More than 2,000 coffee houses operated in London at the beginning of the 1700s alone. They were gathering places for men, and as such drew the ire of women who didn't want men wasting all their time drinking coffee. This came to a head in 1675 when a group of women petitioned the British King Charles II to close all the coffee houses in Britain, due to the time spent inside of them by men. Their complaint read in part, the men might and probably would be employed in and about their lawful calling and affairs, should they not have the opportunity to resort to coffee houses instead. And Charles II did, in fact, issue an order via royal proclamation, which he was forced to retract after just 11 days. People back then loved their coffee. The backlash was simply too severe for the king to ignore. And similar action did take place in Paris, where more than 400 cafes dedicated exclusively to coffee drinkers operated. Voltaire is said himself to have consumed more than 40 cups of coffee per day, usually mixed with chocolate. In British America, the larger towns featured coffee houses where colonists gathered and shared news of the day. As in Europe, women were not part of the clientele of these establishments. During the Enlightenment, the coffee houses served as a place for the exchange of information and opinion, news, gossip, and ideas. In Paris, one French nobleman described the scene in cafes as agreeable places, and described that their customers sometimes rouse themselves to praise everything that is to be blamed and blame everything that is worthy of praise. Essentially, it was full of contrarians looking to argue. They were the historical equivalent of Twitter. Within the doors of the coffee houses and cafes was to be found the freedom of speech, with tongues loosened by doses and doses of caffeine, up to 40 cups a day apparently. Man of the hour Voltaire favoured a Paris coffee house named Café Procope, which was also a favourite of Rousseau's and another leading figure of the Enlightenment, a French jurist and historian named, this is a very French name here, Charles Louis de Secondat, who sometimes used the name Montesquieu. In 1748, Montesquieu published The Spirit of Law, in which he argued for the separation of the powers within government into independent legislative, judicial and executive branches. So his work, recommending depriving the church of governmental power, for which it was banned. Despite the church banning the book and the French government subsequently trying to suppress the entire thing, it was popular throughout Europe, and especially so in Britain and its North American colonies. Coffee houses became source of news through word of mouth, but also through newspapers and pamphlets. And it's worth noting that literacy rates rose throughout the period of the Enlightenment, and coffee houses and cafes distributed, as mentioned, newspapers, pamphlets and books. In many ways, they were a precursor to the internet, in which information and opinion was widely disseminated, although often without any form of confirmation or verification. In London, a dish of coffee, and it was always referred to as a dish, which I don't like, cost anything from a farthing to a penny, and the price of debating within led them to be called penny universities. And for that price, a man could enjoy his beverage, read a newspaper, smoke some good Virginia tobacco, and engage in lively conversation with like-minded men who were looking to argue themselves. So often these conversations were over what was in the newspaper, and many became a favourite haunt of men in similar professions. For example, Jonathan's Coffee House in London Exchange Alley evolved into literally the London Stock Exchange after years of being frequented by the city's stockbrokers. Likewise, the Royal Society for Arts was located in another London coffee house located in Covent Garden that was frequented by artists and art lovers. It was in the coffee house of London, Paris, Vienna, Prague and Berlin and other cities where the scientific discoveries of the age were discussed and, of course, debated. So were the works of writers and the speeches of politicians, the ideas proposing the equality of men and the radical ideas of liberty and individual freedom. Throughout Europe and indeed elsewhere, governments tolerated their existence with, shall we say, varying attempts to suppress the radical viewpoints which emerged from them. The supporters of the Enlightenment quickly gained condemnation by many church authorities, particularly in Catholic France, where the corruption of the church and its priests were frequently the targets of satire. Voltaire opposed not only the church, but Christianity as a faith in general, finding it hypocritical at best, stating, and I quote, "Of all religions, the Christians should of course inspire the most tolerance, but until now Christians had been the most intolerant of all men." He had much on which to base that assertion. Throughout the period preceding the Enlightenment and continuing throughout much of it, religious persecution was annoyingly commonplace in Europe. In Spain and Portugal, as well as in their overseas colonies and possessions, the Inquisition purged Jews, Muslims and others designated by the Catholic authorities as just heretics, which was very wide in its scope and application. In 1738, the Roman Catholic Church added the practice of Freemasonry to their list of heresies. Burning at the stake for heresy continued throughout the Enlightenment under the Inquisition. Yeah, so they were literally burning people at the stake around this time. In the Germanic states, on the other hand, including Austria, Jews found varying degrees of tolerance. Anti-Semitism ran throughout Eastern Europe as well as in the Russian Empire. Jews were not forced to convert to Catholicism or face torture and death as they would be in Spain or Portugal and the associated colonies, but segregated ghettos were common, and the stereotypes, which very sadly persist to the present day, were already well established and used by the institutions and the state. So this is where we get into like the kind of like sad stuff, but to quote like Roland Rat from Horrible Histories, history isn't always nice, which doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it anyway. So when Voltaire lived in the court of Frederick the Great in Prussia, he expressed more or less the same opinions of Judaism as he held for Christianity. His views were relatively moderate in comparison to the other Prussians. France was slightly more tolerant, where church authorities satisfied their anger at heresy through excommunication and the internal condemnation of the immortal soul, and efforts to reclaim the souls of miscreants continued throughout their lifetimes. In specific regards to Voltaire, the church pursued him literally onto his deathbed. The opposition of the Catholic Church and catechism led to many leading thinkers of the Enlightenment to be labelled as atheists, which isn't exactly right. Deism, defined for anyone who doesn't know as the belief in a supreme being which does not directly interfere in the affairs of humanity, was considered to be the religion of the Enlightenment. Voltaire, Rousseau, John Locke, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and scores of others, like these huge Enlightenment figures, professed deist beliefs, and nearly all of them were also Freemasons. And deism kind of joined with Freemasonry as a substitute to Catholicism and submission to the authority of Rome. Freemasons could and very often did discuss affairs unfettered by the dogmas professed by the priests. By the time of the French Revolution, nearly 100,000 Frenchmen were considered to be Freemasons, despite the church having declared it heretical. In Spain, membership in a Masonic lodge could lead to imprisonment or worse. Remember, worse here being literally being burned at the stake. In France, it was ignored. Freemasonry extended even into the nobility, with members of the King's Court proclaiming to be Freemasons. The extent of the influence of Freemasonry on the Enlightenment has long been a subject of debate. Conspiracists often attribute Freemasonry with the seeds of revolution in both America and France, whereas modern scholarship tends to agree that the expansion of Freemasonry was more a result of the Enlightenment rather than a cause of the movement itself. The Roman Church fought let's put it bluntly, a losing battle to suppress Freemasonry as well as other movements of the Enlightenment, and it saw its power and influence in political affairs begin to just wane. As noted, the Enlightenment is largely agreed to have ended with the French Revolution and the ensuing Napoleonic Wars, at least somewhere in between those two things happening, which forever ended the authority of the Catholic Church in the governments of Europe. In North and South America, civil governments were created without a defined relationship of religion to the state. The founders of the United States went to great lengths to adopt Montesquieu's separation of powers and to establish a distinct separation of church and of state, which, as of the time of recording this, it's still hanging in there by a thread. It's trying. Yeah, so for those determined to undo what they perceive as an ungodly travesty, a glance at Europe during the Enlightenment may prove quite instructive. There's a lot of quotes in here that I am not comfortable saying, but it's important to remember history. The old quote is like, those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. So I'll soldier on through, but just know that I am very uncomfortable saying a lot of the words I'm about to say, and that these are quotes from historical figures who, thankfully, their ideas are in decline, if not outright eradicated in most parts of the world. So just hold on to that at the very least. So, the period of the Enlightenment during which daring ideas regarding the equality of man and individual liberty emerged also saw, paradoxically, the continued expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. European colonies in North and South America, as well as in the Caribbean, existed to create wealth for their mother states. France, Spain, Portugal, and several others maintained lucrative sugar plantations in the New World. In British North America, tobacco was an early cash crop and later followed by coffee, rice, and indigo. All were labour-intensive crops requiring a large workforce to plant, husband, harvest, and prepare them for shipping, and the Atlantic slave trade required the acquisition of vast amounts of slave labour, usually through purchase along the west coast of Africa. The enslaved were then shipped under, I don't think I need to say this, but quite horrendous conditions to the colonies where they were absorbed into the plantation economy. The sugar colonies in particular were decidedly unkind, where oppressive heat, putrid water, malaria, smallpox, dysentery, and countless other diseases in existence to the soul-crushing, back-breaking labour claimed the lives of literally thousands of people. Great fortunes were made in the slave trade, though thankfully by the mid-1700s, slave traders experienced difficulties manning their ships with crews. In his seminal work, The Social Contract, released in 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered an abstract condemnation of slavery, though he did not directly address the Atlantic slave trade, which was then at its height. His attacks on slavery, which were frequent, instead addressed what he perceived as slavery caused by his contemporaries living under a non-representative government, as well as under a church system which demanded both blind obedience to its dogmas and vast amounts of financial support. About the race-based slavery of blacks subjugated as forced labour under whites as living chattel, he was conspicuously silent. Getting back to Voltaire, he is said by many to have directly opposed slavery, though in truth he directly profited from it. A wealthy man, Voltaire invested in Caribbean sugar plantations, trade alliances to the East Indies, and in at least one known instance, in the passage of a literal slave ship. His opposition to slavery was not directed at the practice of slavery itself, but at the conditions under which the enslaved were forced to live and work. He justified his position by espousing the belief that whites were superior to blacks. The belief in white supremacy was then almost universally accepted in Europe. The primitive conditions under which most West Africans live were cited as the evidence of the inferiority of their race. The same attitude was directed towards the indigenous peoples encountered by the Europeans in the Americas, many of whom were also enslaved by colonizers. In Voltaire's own words, and these are Voltaire's words, not mine, and it's weird how this quote isn't held up there with all of his others, "Whites are superior to Negroes, just like Negroes are superior to monkeys, and monkeys are superior to oysters." Decades before Darwin, Voltaire wrote a disparaging description of the physical appearance of black men, speculated on their descent from the apes, and concluded that their features, and I quote once again, "make a prodigious difference between them and other species of men." And sadly, Voltaire was certainly not alone in his views regarding race. The aforementioned David Hume, the philosopher from Scotland if you remember, wrote, and I quote once again, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general all other species of men, to be naturally inferior to the whites." The existence of the Atlantic slave trade, and indeed its expansion during a period known widely as the Age of Enlightenment, and the support it found among the supposed leaders of this movement, is often ignored in discussions of the age. The Enlightenment was clearly not enlightening for all. One can only speculate what views would be held by Hume, Voltaire, Rousseau, and others today. The Enlightenment came to an end with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars, as mentioned previously. When they ended after 2.5 decades of nearly incessant bloodletting, Great Britain was the world's great leading superpower, its empire stretching literally across the globe. The ideas of the Enlightenment stretched across the globe with it as well, as did further advances in science, philosophy, medicine, physics, and the achievements of the Industrial Revolution. The names of the leaders of the Enlightenment still resonate throughout history. Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, Hume, Franklin, Newton exist in a sort of pantheon of the mind as great men from human past. Their achievements have been mythologized in some cases, all but forgotten, and in others they have become controversial. But from studying them, their contemporaries, and the world in which they lived and worked, it is clear that history is never simple. It is a complex story with many nuances and a lot of uncomfortable truths. The Age of Enlightenment was, like all of human history, an age of, to put it lightly, contradiction. At its core, it was an overthrow of centuries of superstitions, of prejudice, of misunderstandings, though in many cases they were replaced by new superstitions, new prejudices, new misunderstandings. The men who led the movement and are still studied today as luminaries of it were, like all men before them and all men since, flawed, limited in their knowledge, subject to their time, and curious as to their existence and their interactions with the rest of nature and the natural world. Nearly all of their ideas regarding education, religion, the role of government, the role of nations, and the impact of humanity on nature remain subjects of debate to this day, and in that way, the Age of Enlightenment is still not over. Humanity still has some distance to go before it can consider itself to be truly enlightened. It still, if you'll forgive us, needs to dare to know. So I hope everybody found this video to be educational, informative, and entertaining. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things, even, considering some of the parts that made me wildly uncomfortable. But as I've said multiple times throughout the video, history is not always nice, but, it's nice to remember that. Does that work? Is that saying, I'm going to roll with it? But yeah, thank you to everyone watching at home. If you did enjoy the video, go let the author Larry Hallsworth know at the social media links you can find for them. I'm also at social media links you can find below if you want to go see if Smallwood really is my last name, or just see me talking about movies or posting gifs of possums. I've also got another YouTube channel where I'm it's more trivia based, fact theme with Cal Smallwood, and another one called Wiki Weekends, which is exactly as the name suggests, a channel where I riff on wikis from across the internet with a good friend of mine. As always, you can leave a like to improve our analytics, you can leave a comment with feedback, suggestions, and ideas for future videos below. Subscribe for more content like this, and as I always like to say, have the day you deserve. Cheers.